What if some of the horror movies mocked, ignored, or nearly buried in the 1960s were actually years ahead of their audiences? But decades later, horror fans turned these supposed failures into cult treasures. Today, we're counting down 1960s horror movies that stumbled when they arrived, but somehow became more famous after Hollywood had already given up on them. If you love forgotten horror history, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, because some of the strangest films ever made are still ahead. Number 18. The Beast of Yucca Flats, 1961. Sometimes failure becomes more entertaining than success, and few movies demonstrate that better than this extremely strange desert nightmare. The story follows Soviet scientist Joseph Jaworski, who arrives in America carrying important information. Before he can safely deliver it, he accidentally wanders into an atomic testing area. Radiation transforms Jaworski into a dangerous wandering figure who begins moving through the desert, while local authorities attempt to understand what has happened. The plot sounds like a standard atomic-age monster film, but almost nothing about its execution feels normal. Much of the dialogue was recorded separately, while narration explains scenes that do not always connect smoothly. One memorable section follows two young boys who become separated from their family in the desert. Authorities search from an airplane while their father desperately tries to locate them. The movie was barely noticed during its original run, while later critics became extremely harsh toward it. Yet that terrible reputation eventually gave it another life. Television screenings and cult movie programs introduced it to viewers who enjoyed its unusual editing, strange narration, and accidental humor. Today, people rarely watch The Beast of Yucca Flats because they expect polished filmmaking. They watch because almost no other horror movie from the decade feels quite this strange. Number 17. The Brain That Wouldn't Die, 1962. Long before modern horror became obsessed with extreme medical experiments, this low-budget shocker was already asking what might happen when a brilliant doctor decided ordinary ethical rules no longer mattered. Dr. Bill Kortner is a talented surgeon experimenting with unusual transplant procedures. After a terrible automobile accident involving his fiancée Jan, Bill refuses to accept the situation and manages to keep her alive while searching for a way to restore her. While Bill travels around searching for someone suitable for his experiment, Jan remains inside his laboratory. She soon discovers that a mysterious creature is locked behind a nearby door. Instead of simply fearing it, she begins communicating with the captive. One of the film's strongest moments comes when Jan realizes the hidden creature also hates Bill. Their strange connection slowly turns the laboratory against the man who created the situation in the first place. Critics originally treated the movie as cheap exploitation, pointing toward its limited effects and exaggerated performances. But late-night television and home video gave it a second chance. What looked disposable in 1962 gradually became exactly the kind of bizarre horror experience cult audiences love. Before we continue, tell us in the comments which supposedly bad horror movie you secretly enjoy. And subscribe if forgotten cinema is your thing, because the failures get much stranger from here. Number 16. The Terror, 1963. Behind the foggy coastlines and Gothic castle is a movie whose production history became almost as strange as its actual story. A young French officer named André Duvalier, played by Jack Nicholson, encounters a mysterious woman while traveling near the sea. Fascinated by her, he follows the woman through a bleak landscape and eventually reaches an isolated castle occupied by Baron von Leppe, played by Boris Karloff. Something about the mysterious visitor feels impossible, because she appears strangely connected to someone from the Baron's past. Old secrets involving betrayal, guilt, mistaken identities, and supernatural revenge slowly begin emerging. The plot can become confusing, but the movie's fog-covered landscapes and lonely castle create a strong Gothic atmosphere. One of its most memorable sequences simply follows Nicholson as he pursues the mysterious woman through misty beaches and ruined surroundings. Those scenes feel almost like a dream, rather than part of an ordinary horror story. The production itself was famously chaotic, with Roger Corman working quickly and several filmmakers contributing to the project. Audiences never turned it into a major success, but its strange construction eventually became part of its charm. Today, The Terror survives as a fascinating combination of Boris Karloff, young Jack Nicholson, Gothic scenery, and filmmaking improvisation. Number 15. Dementia 13, 1963. Before Francis Ford Coppola became one of the biggest directors in Hollywood, he was working around Roger Corman's low-budget filmmaking operation. The result was this eerie Gothic mystery, centered on a wealthy family, an old mansion, and memories of a child who died years earlier. Louise Halloran becomes worried about her financial future after her husband unexpectedly dies. Instead of immediately telling his family, she travels to their ancestral Irish estate and attempts to protect her position in the family inheritance. Once inside the mansion, Louise discovers that the entire household remains emotionally trapped by the death of Kathleen, a young girl who drowned years earlier. Her mother cannot escape the memory, and Louise decides she may be able to use that grief to manipulate the family. One of the movie's most famous scenes takes place near the pond associated with Kathleen's death. Louise enters the dark water as part of her plan, but the quiet nighttime sequence suddenly becomes far more dangerous than she expected. Released as part of a double feature, Dementia 13 received nowhere near the attention Coppola's later movies would command. Critics complained about its confusing story and inexpensive appearance. Yet horror fans eventually rediscovered the eerie black-and-white photography, strange family tension, and sudden bursts of suspense. Today it feels like an early glimpse of a major filmmaker learning how atmosphere and family conflict could drive an entire story. Number 14. The Horror of Party Beach, 1964. What happens when a cheerful beach party movie suddenly gets invaded by radioactive creatures? The answer is one of the most bizarre horror combinations of the entire 1960s. Teenagers are enjoying music, dancing, romance, and the usual carefree beach atmosphere when radioactive material is dumped into the ocean. The contamination interacts with remains beneath the water and creates bizarre amphibious creatures. Soon these monsters begin appearing around the community, while scientist Dr. Gavin and several younger characters attempt to discover what they are and how they can be stopped. The creatures themselves became the movie's real stars. With enormous eyes and bizarre mouths, they look unlike the carefully designed monsters appearing in major studio productions of the period. Their strange appearance eventually became more famous than the story itself. One memorable sequence shifts directly from teenagers enjoying music into monster chaos. That collision between beach party entertainment and atomic horror perfectly captures why the film feels so unusual. Critics eventually placed it among the more ridiculous monster movies of its era, and it never became a major commercial hit. Yet cult audiences embraced exactly what mainstream viewers rejected. Its rock music, beach culture, radioactive anxiety, handmade creatures, and total lack of restraint transformed The Horror of Party Beach into a movie that is almost impossible to confuse with anything else. Number 13. The Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living and Became Mixed-Up Zombies, 1964. Even the title sounds like somebody challenged a filmmaker to create the strangest movie possible. Director Ray Dennis Steckler responded with a mixture of carnival horror, musical performances, hypnosis, romance, fortune-telling, and monster cinema. A young man named Jerry visits a carnival with his friends and becomes fascinated by dancer Carmelita. But behind the colorful attractions is fortune teller Madame Estrella, a woman using hypnotic control for much darker purposes. Jerry eventually falls under her influence while strange victims from previous experiments remain hidden around the carnival. What begins as a night of entertainment slowly turns into a bizarre nightmare where almost anything can happen. The carnival setting became the movie's greatest asset. Bright performances and dancing are suddenly replaced by dark corridors, uncomfortable faces, and mysterious rooms. One moment feels like a musical, while the next feels like a horror film from another planet. Critics dismissed the production as amateurish and chaotic, while mainstream audiences had little reason to take it seriously. Yet decades later, that chaos became the entire attraction. Cult fans embraced its unusual photography, unpredictable editing, eccentric performances, and complete refusal to behave like a normal film. Some cult classics are rediscovered because people eventually realize they were masterpieces. Others become famous because viewers cannot believe somebody actually made them. This movie somehow manages to fit comfortably into both categories. Number 12. The Creeping Terror, 1964. Few monsters in horror history have moved this slowly and still managed to become famous. After an unidentified spacecraft appears in rural California, local authorities and scientists discover evidence that a strange creature has escaped. The enormous monster begins crawling across the countryside, while officials desperately search for a way to destroy it. On paper, that sounds like the setup for a perfectly ordinary alien invasion movie. On screen, things become much stranger. The creature moves so slowly that escaping from it appears relatively easy, yet people somehow continue falling into its path. The unusual monster design makes the creature look almost like a giant moving carpet. The movie's legendary sequence takes place inside a crowded community hall. Couples dance while music plays, completely unaware that the creature is slowly approaching. What was designed as suspense gradually becomes something far more unintentionally amusing. Production difficulties contributed to the unusual final result, which contains heavy narration, missing dialogue, strange editing, and homemade effects. The film received almost no serious respect when it appeared, but complete failure sometimes produces a strange kind of immortality. Television screenings and programs celebrating unusual cinema eventually introduced the movie to audiences who enjoyed watching it together. Today, the creeping terror is remembered far more clearly than dozens of technically superior horror movies released during the same decade. Number 11. Incubus, 1966. Making an American horror movie entirely in Esperanto was certainly one way to make distribution difficult. William Shatner stars as Mark, a morally decent soldier who attracts the attention of a supernatural woman named Kia. Kia is accustomed to corrupting morally weak men, but Mark refuses to behave the way she expects. His resistance transforms what should have been another easy victory into a much more dangerous supernatural conflict. As Kia becomes increasingly frustrated, darker forces are called upon. What follows is a battle involving temptation, morality, and supernatural influence, rather than a traditional monster story. The movie's black and white photography makes it especially memorable. Beaches, fields, religious buildings, and empty landscapes look less like America and more like locations from an old European nightmare. The Esperanto dialogue gave the movie immediate curiosity value, but it also created problems. Wider distribution proved extremely difficult, and even some Esperanto speakers reportedly criticized the actor's pronunciation. Eventually, surviving prints became so difficult to find that Incubus was considered lost. Then a copy was discovered in France, allowing the movie to return decades later. That rediscovery transformed a failed cinematic experiment into a genuine cult curiosity. Today, it feels less like an ordinary 1960s horror release and more like an artifact recovered from an alternate history of cinema. Number 10. Manos, The Hands of Fate, 1966. Some movies become classics because audiences instantly recognize their greatness. Manos, The Hands of Fate, traveled almost exactly the opposite road. A family driving through Texas becomes completely lost and eventually reaches an isolated lodge. There they meet Torgo, an extremely unusual caretaker who explains that he serves a mysterious figure known only as the Master. From the moment the family arrives, nothing seems normal. Torgo behaves strangely, leaving the lodge becomes increasingly difficult, and the mysterious Master eventually appears surrounded by women dressed in long white clothing. The plot involves supernatural control and a strange group living far away from ordinary society. Yet the storytelling itself became much more famous than the actual narrative. Driving scenes seem to continue forever. Conversations contain unexpected pauses. Characters sometimes react in ways that barely connect with what happened seconds earlier. Torgo's unusual walk became especially famous among cult fans. The movie barely registered during its original release and almost disappeared completely. Decades later, however, a surviving copy was rediscovered and eventually featured on Mystery Science Theater 3000. That appearance transformed everything. Viewers who had never heard of the movie suddenly became fascinated by it. Manos eventually inspired screenings, merchandise, stage adaptations, and follow-up projects. A movie that failed in almost every traditional sense somehow achieved exactly what most independent filmmakers dream about. People are still talking about it generations later. Number 9. Eye of the Devil, 1966. A beautiful French estate, ancient family traditions, major stars, and disturbing pagan rituals should have been enough to create a prestige horror success. Instead, audiences largely stayed away. David Niven plays Philippe de Montfaucon, owner of an ancestral vineyard facing another disastrous season. Without giving his wife Catherine a proper explanation, Philippe suddenly returns to his family estate in France. Catherine, played by Deborah Kerr, follows him and quickly realizes the peaceful countryside is hiding something deeply unsettling. Local people behave strangely, while Philippe seems trapped by responsibilities he refuses to explain. Two of the most mysterious figures are siblings Christian and Odile. Sharon Tate plays Odile with an almost dreamlike calmness, making her appear beautiful and threatening at exactly the same time. One memorable sequence involves Odile using a bow and arrow, while Catherine watches her with increasing suspicion. Nothing about the beautiful setting should appear frightening, yet the scene creates a strong sense that danger has become completely normal to everyone except Catherine. The black and white photography gives the estate an ancient and almost timeless atmosphere. Unfortunately, the movie did not become the commercial success MGM wanted, and it gradually disappeared behind more famous supernatural films. Years later, horror fans began looking again. Its pagan traditions, isolated community, mysterious rituals, and countryside setting now seem like an early version of themes that later became associated with folk horror. What appeared slow and unusual in the 1960s eventually became the reason viewers wanted to rediscover it. Number 8. The Sorcerers, 1967. Imagine being able to control another person from a distance, while also feeling everything that person experiences. That unsettling concept powers one of Boris Karloff's most unusual late-career horror movies. Professor Marcus Montserrat has created a machine capable of hypnotically controlling another human being. Together with his wife Estelle, he convinces a bored young man named Mike to participate in the experiment. The machine does much more than make Mike obey commands. Marcus and Estelle can experience his physical sensations. When Mike moves through the city, they feel the excitement. When he experiences pleasure or danger, those sensations are transmitted directly back to them. At first, Marcus sees his discovery as an extraordinary scientific achievement. Estelle sees something far more tempting. Old age has removed much of the excitement from her life, but controlling Mike allows her to experience youth again without leaving her home. One of the movie's best sequences simply shows the elderly couple sitting together while experiencing Mike's adventures elsewhere. Their expressions make the technology frightening without requiring expensive visual effects. Estelle eventually becomes addicted to the experience and begins pushing Mike toward increasingly reckless situations. Marcus slowly realizes that the machine he created has given his wife power she no longer wants to surrender. The movie received limited commercial attention and never became one of Karloff's famous titles. Yet modern audiences have discovered ideas involving voyeurism, remote control, addiction, youth obsession, and experiencing life through another person. Those themes feel surprisingly modern, which has helped The Sorcerers become far more interesting with age. Number 7. The Fearless Vampire Killers, 1967. Roman Polanski combined vampire horror, comedy, romance, and enormous Gothic sets. But American audiences seemed uncertain about exactly what kind of movie they were watching. Professor Abronsius is an aging vampire researcher traveling through snowy Eastern Europe with his nervous assistant Alfred, played by Polanski himself. Their journey brings them to a remote village where frightened locals behave as if they are hiding something. Alfred quickly becomes fascinated by Sarah, the beautiful daughter of an innkeeper, played by Sharon Tate. When Sarah disappears, the investigation takes Abronsius and Alfred toward the enormous castle of Count von Krolock. The movie becomes increasingly elaborate once they enter the castle. Snow-covered landscapes, candlelit rooms, enormous staircases, costumes, and Gothic architecture make the entire production look like a dark fairy tale. Its most famous sequence is the Vampire Ball. Abronsius and Alfred disguise themselves and attempt to blend into an elegant gathering filled with vampires. Their plan appears successful until a mirror reveals something important. Everyone else has no reflection. The scene combines suspense and comedy, while showing how much effort went into the production design. Yet the American version of the movie was altered and promoted heavily as broad comedy. Over time, however, viewers began appreciating the melancholy beneath the comedy. Sharon Tate's performance, the snowy landscapes, and the beautiful Gothic imagery gained increasing admiration. What once seemed tonally confused eventually became one of the decade's most distinctive vampire cult films. Number 6. Spider Baby, 1967. This bizarre Gothic comedy did not merely suffer from a disappointing release. Production and financial problems delayed it so badly that its chances of finding a normal audience were damaged before most people ever saw it. Lon Chaney Jr. plays Bruno, the loyal caretaker of the Merry family. The surviving Merry children suffer from a fictional inherited condition that causes their behavior to become increasingly primitive as they grow older. Bruno has spent years protecting Elizabeth, Ralph, and Virginia from the outside world. He hides their condition inside a decaying mansion and tries to prevent outsiders from discovering exactly how unusual the family has become. Virginia is especially memorable because she treats dangerous behavior like an innocent childhood game. Her famous spider game involves pretending to be a spider approaching its prey, but what begins playfully quickly becomes genuinely threatening. The sequence perfectly captures the movie's unusual tone. It is creepy, funny, uncomfortable, and strangely innocent all at once. Chaney's Bruno adds another layer because he does not treat the Merry children as monsters. He genuinely loves them and believes he has a responsibility to protect them. That makes his character surprisingly emotional beneath the strange horror comedy surrounding him. Trouble begins when distant relatives arrive at the mansion hoping to gain control of the Merry property. Their presence threatens the strange little world Bruno has worked so hard to keep hidden. Number 5. The Haunting, 1963. Sometimes the most frightening thing a horror movie can show you is almost nothing at all. That approach helped make The Haunting a classic, but it also contributed to the mixed reaction the film received when it first appeared. Dr. John Markway is fascinated by supernatural phenomena and gathers several people inside Hill House, an enormous mansion with a deeply disturbing history. His goal is to investigate whether the building is genuinely haunted. Among the guests is Eleanor Lance, a lonely woman who has spent years caring for her sick mother. For Eleanor, accepting the invitation is partly an escape from a life in which she has rarely been free to make her own decisions. Hill House quickly turns that escape into a nightmare. Doors seem to close by themselves. Strange sounds move through corridors, and the rooms appear designed at angles that make the entire building feel slightly wrong. Director Robert Wise rarely shows viewers a visible supernatural creature. Instead, he allows sound, shadows, architecture, and Eleanor's fear to create the threat. The movie's legendary bedroom sequence demonstrates the technique perfectly. Eleanor and Theodora hear a terrifying pounding moving through the hallway outside their room. The sound grows closer, while the door appears to bend inward. The women can hear something approaching, but neither they nor the audience can clearly see what is causing it. That lack of visual explanation makes the scene more frightening because viewers are forced to create the threat inside their own imagination. Not everyone appreciated the method in 1963. Some audiences expected visible creatures or more obvious supernatural action and felt that too little actually happened. Commercially, the movie achieved only moderate results compared with the enormous reputation it eventually developed. But later generations completely changed the verdict. Number 4. Seconds, 1966. What if somebody offered you the chance to erase your entire life? You could receive a new face, new name, new career, and completely different identity. John Frankenheimer's Seconds takes that fantasy and slowly transforms it into something terrifying. Arthur Hamilton is a successful middle-aged banker who appears to have everything a respectable man should want. Yet underneath that comfortable life, Arthur feels completely empty. Then he is contacted by a mysterious organization known as the Company. They offer him an extraordinary opportunity. Arthur can officially disappear, undergo extensive surgery, and begin living as another person. He accepts and is transformed into Tony Wilson, played by Rock Hudson. Tony is younger-looking, handsome, wealthy, and provided with a fashionable new identity as an artist living in California. At first, the transformation appears perfect. Tony has escaped his old responsibilities and entered a life filled with freedom. Yet it soon becomes clear that changing his face has not changed the person underneath it. One of the movie's most famous sequences takes place during a strange outdoor celebration. Tony becomes surrounded by people behaving with increasing freedom and excitement. For a while, he seems capable of surrendering completely to the new world around him. But when the excitement disappears, his old emptiness returns. That becomes the central nightmare of the film. The company can manufacture a new appearance, history, house, and social circle, but it cannot manufacture happiness. Audiences in 1966 were also not prepared to see Rock Hudson in a movie this unsettling. His image was closely connected with glamorous romances and mainstream entertainment. Here, Hudson appears frightened, uncertain, and emotionally lost. The movie uses his familiar image to make Tony's identity crisis even more uncomfortable. Number 3. Blood and Black Lace, 1964. Modern horror fans immediately recognize the image. A mysterious figure in dark clothing stalks people while hiding behind an almost featureless mask. But Mario Bava was developing that visual nightmare before the formula became familiar. The story takes place around an elegant Roman fashion house, filled with models, designers, complicated relationships, hidden secrets, and jealousy. When one model is found dead, attention soon turns toward a diary containing information several people desperately want to keep hidden. Then the masked attacker begins appearing. The killer's design became one of the film's most influential elements. A pale, featureless mask removes almost every trace of humanity, while dark clothes and a fedora transform the attacker into something closer to a moving shadow than a normal person. Bava's approach to color makes the entire film even more unusual. Rooms glow with intense reds, blues, greens, and purples. Instead of trying to make the fashion house look realistic, he turns it into a nightmare version of a glamorous magazine. One of the film's most celebrated sequences follows a woman through an antique shop while the attacker closes in. Mannequins, furniture, reflections, shadows, and colored lights make every corner of the room suspicious. The viewer begins searching the background for movement because the killer could almost become part of the decoration. Despite its visual imagination, the film was not a major commercial success in Italy. Audiences did not immediately respond to its strange combination of fashion, mystery, elaborate suspense, and horror. But cinema eventually caught up with Bava. Italian giallo movies became increasingly popular during the following years. Mysterious attackers, gloves, masks, fashionable characters, elaborate suspense scenes, and unusual camera movements became central ingredients of the genre. Later slasher filmmakers would also use many similar techniques. Suddenly, Blood and Black Lace no longer looked like an unusual failed experiment. It looked like a blueprint created before most filmmakers realized they needed one. Number 2. Carnival of Souls, 1962. Very few movies demonstrate the power of atmosphere better than this haunting independent production. Made with a tiny budget, it reached relatively few people during its original release, but slowly became one of the most influential cult horror movies of the decade. Mary Henry is riding in a car with two other young women when a reckless challenge on a bridge ends terribly. Their car crashes through the barrier and disappears into the water below. Searchers gather around the area, but hope begins disappearing. Then Mary suddenly emerges from the water. Her survival appears miraculous, yet almost immediately something feels wrong. Mary leaves town and accepts a job as a church organist, hoping that a new environment will allow her to move beyond the accident. Instead, she begins seeing a pale, mysterious man who appears without warning. He watches her through windows, appears beside roads, and seems connected to an abandoned lakeside pavilion that fascinates Mary, even though she has no obvious reason to visit it. Even more disturbing are moments when normal people suddenly seem unable to hear or see her. Mary walks through busy surroundings, attempting to speak to strangers, but everyone continues moving as though she does not exist. The abandoned pavilion becomes the center of the movie's mystery. Mary repeatedly feels drawn toward the enormous empty structure. Eventually, ghostly figures gather there and begin dancing through the darkness. The strange organ music, abandoned location, and dreamlike movement create one of the most unforgettable sequences in low-budget horror history. Director Herc Harvey reportedly made the movie for around $30,000 after spending much of his career creating educational and industrial films. Commercially, things went badly. Distribution problems prevented Carnival of Souls from reaching the audience it needed, and Harvey never directed another dramatic feature. For years, the movie seemed destined to become nothing more than an obscure regional production. Television unexpectedly saved it. Number 1. Peeping Tom, 1960. Could a single horror movie damage the career of one of Britain's major filmmakers because critics believed he had gone too far? That is essentially what happened to director Michael Powell when Peeping Tom appeared in 1960. The story follows Mark Lewis, a quiet young cameraman working around the film industry. On the surface, Mark appears shy, nervous, and relatively harmless. Underneath that personality is a deeply troubling obsession. Mark is fascinated by human fear and uses his movie camera to record frightened expressions. The camera is not simply something he carries, it becomes the way he experiences the world. As the story develops, viewers discover that Mark's obsession began during childhood. His father was a psychologist who repeatedly used him in experiments designed to study fear. Instead of allowing Mark to experience a normal childhood, his father treated his emotions like scientific material. Cameras recorded his reactions, and frightening experiences became part of his daily life. As an adult, Mark continues living through the lens. He can watch other people more easily than he can connect with them. This becomes the movie's most uncomfortable idea, because director Michael Powell does not allow the audience to stand completely outside Mark's behavior. Whenever Mark looks through his camera, the viewers often share his perspective. We are looking through the same lens. One of the movie's most famous sequences involves Mark filming a frightened woman while the camera moves increasingly close to her. That concept was extremely controversial in 1960. So which of these 1960s horror failures deserved its second chance the most? Some were mocked, some nearly vanished, and others were simply too strange for audiences at the time. But cult fans eventually changed their reputations forever. Tell us your favorite in the comments, and mention any forgotten horror movie we should cover next. If you enjoyed this journey through horror history, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.